Hello and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. The fourth session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, that's INC4 for short, which is working towards a legally binding global plastics treaty, opens in Canada later this month. A strong opening to the process has subsequently seen it hampered by the efforts of lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry, as well as by some countries keen to rein in the ultimate ambition of the treaty. EIA's Ocean Campaign has identified the growing problem of plastic pollution years ago and are rightly proud to have helped lead the call for a global plastics treaty. I'm Paul Newman, EIA's Senior Press and Communications Officer, and for today's episode I'm joined by Ocean Campaign Leader Christina Dixon and Ocean Campaigner Jacob Kean-Hammerson to bring us up to date on progress at the talks and what they anticipate at INC4 when it opens on the 23rd of April in Ottawa. Chris, Jacob, welcome and thanks very much for taking the time to join us.
Great to be here, Paul. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Chris, can you get us started with a previously at the INC recap? How were talks left at the end of it and what's happened since?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. So the INC met last in November 2023 in Nairobi for the third round of negotiations. And at that point, we were working with a zero draft text, and that was the basis for discussions. And the idea or the hope was that we would leave INC3 with a mandate for the incoming chair, which is Luis Fallas from Ecuador, to be able to draft a first draft of the treaty. Unfortunately, we did not get that outcome. So what we saw in the meeting, INC3, was that we had the zero draft text, but we also had a kind of new coalition of countries. Let's just call them the unlike-minded countries, because there's already a kind of high ambition like-minded group. But so this was a sort of lower ambition set of countries from our perspective, obviously, who were taking the floor a lot, proposing lots of new additions, raising lots of challenges with the text. And so a lot of space was given to basically accept new submissions and try and get somewhere where we'd be able to have enough content in there to start working towards that first draft. The outcome of that is that we basically now have a text that's over 70 pages long, and it's a compendium of sort of everybody in the world's idea about what should be in a plastics treaty. So it's a very clunky and tricky document, and the chair wasn't able to go and do any refining of that text, really just some high-level editing to bring it all into one document. But that means that it's going to be quite difficult to negotiate this text. So that was the first kind of outcome where things were left. The other thing is that there wasn't a mandate for what's called intersessional work. So we were all hoping to see a mandate for work to happen between sessions. So in particular, that really is applicable for topics where we can see that there was perhaps a divergence of views and a need to have a bit more time to kind of unpack the issues, put ideas out and exchange views. That could relate to things like plastic production, a topic that we're really passionate about, and also financing. But there were also others that could really benefit from this kind of formal intersessional work. Unfortunately, on the Sunday evening of INC3, we found ourselves in a room, a bunch of governments sat around a table trying to agree on basically what would be on this list of intersessional work, and the countries couldn't reach agreement. It was quite a kind of crazy scene, actually, rain pouring down outside, getting into the wee hours of the Sunday. But unfortunately, just no agreement could be reached. So the governments that were trying to figure this out went back to the plenary room empty-handed with no kind of decision text for the intersessional work. The chair had to kind of leave in a hurry to catch a flight. The interpreters said they ran out of time and couldn't do any further interpretation work. So essentially, the meeting was brought to a close, neither with the agreement on the first draft nor the mandate for intersessional work. So that's where we ended up. That sounds like real bad news, but actually, in the absence of these kind of formal decisions, I think there are sort of two outcomes from my perspective, which are, let's say, positive. One is that having the kind of high ambition coalition set of governments take more of a backseat in INC3 and to have this kind of lower ambition group of countries really kind of get everything off their chests. I think we're now in a position where there's no case to be made that all the countries haven't had a chance to share their views. So that's kind of positive in my view. And then the other thing is that in the absence of a formal mandate for intersessional work, which for me was the biggest blow, actually what we've seen is that countries have been getting together informally and holding convenings around different topics. And actually that kind of informal setting to exchange views and kind of sit across the table and break bread, not just with countries that all agree with each other, I think has actually served the negotiations really positively. So hopefully some of those outputs and discussions from the intersessional period that were more informal can now be fed into the formal process, and we can start moving the discussion forward. So I apologize, that was a very long recap. However, I thought you might benefit from bringing everyone into the kind of microcosm of the world that Jacob and I live in every day at the moment.
Well, no, I think it's fine because absolutely, including myself, people don't necessarily understand how these processes work, and there's an assumption, I guess, that it's a bunch of high-profile heads in a room, kind of nodding sagely and agreeing stuff. And obviously, as you say, a lot of the grunt work, if you like, is done between those sessions. How much do you think it will have held things up in the actual progress of the talks to have not had that intersessional opportunity?
That's really tricky to say. The gap between sessions is very short, and between INC 3 and 4 we actually had Christmas for many countries in the world, for example, which meant that things kind of tend to grind to a halt anyway, and so what could have taken place formally, I guess, is a big question. Would they have been able to convene, large formal sessions to get countries to exchange views in that timeline? I'm not actually sure they would have. So the big question really is whether we can still get to a treaty text by the end of 2024. That's the timeline that we're working with. And at the moment, without having text to negotiate, that's going to be really, really difficult. It's certainly not out of the question, but not being able to advance conversations on some of these more controversial topics has put us in a bit of a precarious spot, to be completely honest. So now we're going to need to see things really advance at the next round of negotiations, and we're certainly going to need to see some intersessional work between INC 4 and 5, otherwise we'll almost certainly overshoot the deadline.
Yeah, well, that brings us conveniently to the next round of talks, which is INC 4. Jacob, what's on the table at the next session?
Yeah, I think despite all the challenges and some of the non-outcomes that Chris described, really, of INC 3, and the stuff not coming out, actually, gladly, it means that everything is still on the table. So all of the things that this treaty could do that are very, very positive, that we see in terms of potentially being able to deal with our overproduction and consumption of plastics, makes sense to the sort of difficult landscape of financing for developing countries on addressing the plastic pollution challenge and crisis, incentivizing new models and systems of delivery like reuse. They're all still on the table. But there's quite a bit more on the table, as Chris mentioned, than there was previously. There's this huge body of text that needs to be negotiated. So that is going to be a challenge in terms of how is the negotiating committee going to start to refine this text to get it closer to something that looks like a final treaty in our in the timeline that we have. And with everything being on the table, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything gets discussed and continually progressed. And that's one of the challenges that Chris already touched on, is that despite things being on the table, we see these kind of obstruction and, countries feeling like maybe their views weren't heard, and just a real slow and tedious amount of progress. So it's great that things are still on the table, but what we need to start doing is looking at spending genuine negotiating time, properly discussing the issues at hand, and actually trying to find a way through these tricky negotiations into looking at what are the possibilities that could be done, and accepting that this is a negotiation at this point. Talking about something doesn't mean that we're agreeing to something. So it's fine that we can talk about a challenging subject like production, and we shouldn't shy away from that. So rather than just what's on the table, it's about how we discuss those things on the table and actually addressing it with a proper negotiation and conversation, and rather than potentially pandering to some of these sort of obstructionist tactics that we've seen to date. So I in some ways, I hope that answers your question, Paul, about what's on the table, but also how we need to start to think about addressing it.
Yeah. I'm thinking in terms of, as Chris said, that there's so much in that kind of document now with different perspectives and different countries with their different ambitions. And we've got, the high ambition coalition of countries. There's the coalition of the unwilling, for want of a better term, where they kind of would rather see the whole process watered down. So I presume it's not just a matter of taking this massive text and crunching it down to something more manageable. It's going to have to come down to picking a path, isn't it? I mean, I would imagine that document's got the input from the lower ambition, who would rather it just become a problem for consumers to recycle while industry carries on producing, and then you've got the higher ambition which says no, we've got to go and cut it off at the source. So I imagine that's part of the process of the next meeting is going to be to whittle that down to an actual direction they want to travel in.
Exactly, Paul. And I think what you have the full suite of high ambition and then a kind of sequentially, I guess, lower ambition set of options for each provision that could take. So what part of the process will also be sort of trying to consolidate that into saying, how many options do we really have here? Is it 8 that we can see on this document, or is it really 2 or 3? And trying to find that way, that path through, and allowing us to sort of move through those conversations in that manner as well. And that will be really key. And that will take some leadership, some guts, some courage, and obviously there will be some uncomfortability for some discussing issues that they might not want to see, but that's how a negotiation works. And we really need to start accepting that that's what we're doing, rather than just allowing ourselves to get bogged down continuously, because we don't have as much time, where time is running out, and we need to start acting in that manner.
As if we're short of time.
Exactly. Short of time in the negotiations, and short of time to deal with some of the crises we're facing in the world.
Yeah. So far as we're concerned, and just to get into some of the specifics for a moment, what are some of the critical issues that we think, or rather you think, need to be resolved at this session so that we can move ahead?
So I think, in terms of the critical issues, for us, EIA have been quite consistent in what we think the most important aspects and provisions of the treaty are. Fundamentally, it's important that this treaty addresses the full life cycle of plastics. And that starts at the very minimum at the point of production. And so we need to start to think about how we are bringing, as the mandate for the negotiators were given, how we start to address the production and consumption of plastic and bring it to a sustainable level, sustainable production and consumption. It's a mentioned in the mandate. It's part of our sustainable development goals that the world needs to achieve by 2030. And we have failed to have a genuine conversation about what that could look like. So I think that's something that we need to resolve, certainly. EIA have an upcoming report where we've looked at what type of provisions and how you might start to think about setting production controls. So for example, how are we defining what our collective global ambition might be, so that we can have a marker, a line in the sand, or a compass guiding us that say, how do we design our measures to achieve this global ambition? And then through that, start to have a think about how would we target different plastics and polymers? Would it be the polymers, for example, that contribute a huge amount to market share, but also a huge amount of waste generation? Is it these commodity plastics that are often used for low value throwaway applications? And that report that we looked at has started to look at how you could achieve, just by targeting a small number of polymers that contribute to a huge market share, you could start to look at, within 25 years, reducing the amount of plastics we consume by up to 60%. We can look at how we can reduce waste generation by some billions of tons, and prevent the sort of mismanaged waste going out into pollution, and also achieve all of the circular economy objectives that we want to achieve in terms of reuse and looking at secondary markets for collection and recycling where that is feasible. We have a report coming out that really talks about, hopefully we think, talks about how we can start to negotiate this and go about a conversation. And then just to a few other points, again, some of the issues that need resolving will be what are the types of financing and structure of funding that we're going to provide to countries. Let's step out of the paradigm that we're in, where we're entrenched in one position versus the other, no production or must be production, a certain type of financial mechanism versus another one. And actually, if we start to have conversations about what is it that we want to do and how might we want to do it, the form of it will start to take place better. So I think actually one of the things really that needs to be resolved, at least is how we have these conversations, rather because it's a problem we have across the board. But certainly financing, production are absolutely key. But also some of the areas we work on is on fishing gear, which are a huge impacting type of plastics. It's directly into the placed, its function is directly into the environment, and then there's reuse, other areas right the way across the life cycle that will be critical to ending plastic pollution. But yeah, we need to start thinking about solving the way we're having these discussions to make progress.
And just for clarity, when you talk about financial mechanisms, are we talking about something like under the Montreal Protocol, where everybody chips in to help other countries that are economically unable to transition away from them, to actually support them through that process?
Yeah, I think that's the type of thing. So EIA has obviously worked for a very long time at the Montreal Protocol and has a huge amount of experience, and have watched as the Montreal Protocol's multilateral fund has delivered consistently funds to support the equitable phase down and phase out of ozone depleting substances, and now it begins to look at reducing HFCs. So we've looked at that model and seen its benefit, and we've written a lot and spoken a lot about the benefit that it could have in the plastics space. But we haven't even had a discussion on the type of costs that would need to be covered in the realm of plastics. We haven't had that discussion yet. So we do need to sort of, it's very clear that some favor this type of fund, the Montreal Protocol style, and others favor relying on, for example, an existing fund. However, we need to start to have a conversation to see what is best. So once again, we're bogged down in the mire, talking, and we haven't had a chance to talk to each other and properly negotiate yet. So yes, we favor that style of the Montreal Protocol, but let's figure out what the functions are going to need to be.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense to grind through all that detail and hard work now, rather than come up with a treaty that looks fantastic, but then we haven't talked about how it would be implemented, and then you end up with another round of negotiations to talk about, now the treaty we actually got, what do we do with it? Chris, as ever with this sort of process, it starts out looking as if the end point is a long way off, but suddenly it looms into view at quite a rate of knots, and I think that's probably a position where we're getting at now. I recall when we first started doing podcasts on this process, it did seem a ridiculously long way in the future. And I was thinking to myself, come on guys, there's a major planetary crisis here, can we not speed up a bit? But obviously, as you both outlined, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done on the way towards that. Obviously, the timeline for these talks is pretty tight, as we're getting into the final sprint to the deadline at the end of this year. What do you think needs to happen to actually meet the deadline that has been set by the UN?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I'm simultaneously torn between wanting it to be over and not wanting it to be over, just based on my current levels of busyness. But yeah, I think it's really important to both see the timeline as a deadline that's helpful to facilitate conversation, but not something that has to limit ambition, if you see what I mean. And so I think it will be really important in the coming months to identify, in particular, what needs to be agreed by the end of 2024 that will allow us the possibility to start and strengthen over time. Start and strengthen is a concept which basically means, drafting a text which creates the kind of infrastructure, the legal infrastructure for what you want to do, but it does allow kind of simple modification to increase ambition basically going forward as new information becomes available. So we've always been advocates for ensuring that the right elements are in the treaty text to allow that strengthening, especially when the timeline was agreed. But at the same time, we want to have something good by the end of this year as well, right? We don't want something so skeletal that then it's the next sort of 20 years adding elements. So it's a tricky balance. I think from EIA's perspective, we really agree in a plastics treaty that works for everyone, and it ensures that all countries are part of the solution. So basically, we want to see an equitable transition for the world, right, as we move towards ending plastic pollution. And I think that's why we're such strong advocates for example, as Jacob was talking about the financing. We need that means of implementation to ensure that countries can meet their obligations and that those aspects are fair. But at the same time, leaving no country behind doesn't mean holding all countries back. And what we've seen so far is that a rather small group of countries have been able to stall the negotiations. And so it's like the kind of bigger sort of collective ambitious group are having to kind of come down to that aspect, whereas in reality what we want to see is that sort of smaller group coming up. Negotiations are about meeting somewhere in the middle, and I think we have to be really careful about not meeting at the bottom to accommodate those needs. And so thinking really specifically about INC4, there are some kind of key ingredients, I think, to move the negotiations forward. I would kind of summarize these as: one, effective chairing. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a new chair, which I think is a great opportunity to just kind of have a bit of a reset, not to sort of, disparage the previous chair, but, obviously it wasn't working. He was having a very difficult time in the negotiations. And so now we have a chance, a new kind of approach to managing the flow of the negotiations. So this can be a bit of a kind of reboot moment. And hopefully under the new guidance, maybe there'll be some different ways of kind of structuring the work, organizing the conversations, and also problem solving when issues do arise. Because undoubtedly, let's not pretend here, there's going to be problems in these negotiations for sure. I don't know what people are plotting, but they're plotting something for sure. And I think the other aspect, or the other ingredient, is around text. So we talked about this kind of big compendium document, which is not actually text. And there are some things at the moment, the way I look at it, they are kind of drafting decisions. So we could quite quickly kind of combine some of the text that's there in this document that's been presented, and kind of essentially kick that over to drafting. It's nearly ready to become text, right? It's not controversial. It's pretty simple in nature. And we can start moving that and start populating the treaty. Then there are other aspects which are what I would call kind of policy decisions, and they're just things that we haven't resolved yet, even conceptually. Jacob talked about the collective global ambition. And when you look at the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees, the biodiversity framework, 30 by 30, we don't have that North Star yet for the plastics treaty, right? We don't have a 1.5 degrees for plastics. We have this idea about ending plastic pollution, but even at the point of saying, is that ending kind of emissions and releases throughout the life cycle of plastics, starting at production? That's kind of, it's there in the mandate, but it's like the conversation has been stunted by this inability to say what we're actually what collectively we're striving towards. So the High Ambition Coalition talk about ending plastic pollution by 2040. So they've tried to kind of attach a date to it. We do need something like that to guide that conversation around the policy decisions that are yet to be taken. And we need to be able to spend dedicated time in these negotiations unpacking those policy decisions and then thinking about how we move towards text. So what is really important, if there's any negotiator listening to this right now, is kind of coming with, I'm sure they are, I've been told they love listening to the three of us chatting treating. I don't actually think, I don't know if there's another INC podcast in the mix to compete. But anyway, so coming to the negotiations with text proposals in the pocket, and they can be text proposals that, countries are working on in little groups, or even just countries that have said, we've got something in mind, let's just propose that in the discussions and throw it up on the screen, because things become a lot clearer and a lot more concrete when we have text up on the screen and countries can look at that, reflect on it and say, we like that, we don't like that. At the moment, we're still kind of very much in the ideas exchange setting. And then I guess finally, the other key ingredient, if we want a strong and effective treaty, I think, is for the High Ambition Coalition to really step up their game. I think that the hack did what was necessary at INC3, which was to kind of take a bit more of a backseat. But, that is a big group of countries with quite divergent interests, but they've agreed at the ministerial level for some kind of common elements that should be in the treaty. And those are the kind of bones of an effective treaty. So now we really need to see the hack pushing on some of those pieces around production, for example, around chemicals and polymers of concern, and being a lot more vocal and using their kind of the power of that alliance to ensure that we're not, the world is not being held to ransom or held back by a small group of countries that don't want even production or even products to be in scope of the conversation. So the timeline is tight, but I think agreeing what's a kind of now decision, what's the thing that we want by the end of 2024 versus something that could be, an annex that could be populated for COP1, for example, that kind of shopping list and saying, okay, we need this now. we can put that on next week's shopping list. That also needs to happen. And so that's why the mandate for the intersessional work between the next two sessions will be really important, because as we run into INC 5, unless they decide to make that meeting longer, we're actually, I can't remember the actual number of negotiation days that are left, but I think it's something like 13 or 14, maybe Jacob remembers, but it's not that many days left in a room together, actually.
Yeah. You mentioned obviously the low ambition parties, or the lower ambition parties, to be fair to them. To what extent is that based on the country's own specific concerns, and to what extent might that be the long hand of industry lobbyists? Because I know we've touched on this before, and I suppose in very simplistic terms, the petrochemical industries around the world foresaw global warming, if you listen to some reports, as much as 50 years or more ago, and that their escape plan was to be prepared to transition into plastics with their products rather than just take the hit. And obviously that's been a big part in this whole plastic negotiation process, has been the petrochemical industries looking to some extent to safeguard their own profit streams. I suppose what I'm asking is, to what extent is the lower ambition driven by that, or informed by that particular lobby?
It's a fair enough question, and I think that when you look at what's happening in the plastics negotiations, we are seeing the kind of climate playbook being deployed here. So kind of obstructionist tactics, and often from the very same countries that are promoting fossil fuel interests in the climate negotiations are the same ones who are active here. And so you do have countries that are opposing kind of, let's call them upstream controls, so things related to production, who are large producing countries. And I think it's really important to note that whilst the number of countries opposing production controls isn't that great, they're not insignificant countries. We're talking about the sort of Chinas, the Saudi Arabias, a few others, but not all of their interests are completely aligned. So for sure, there's a big sort of fossil fuel lobbyist influence on some of the delegations, particularly the large producing countries. But you can also say that some countries that are aligned with this kind of unlike-minded group, they're not necessarily opposed, but they're more in what I would call a camp of kind of uncertainty, concerned that things have moved too quickly, concerned about what these measures might mean for their economic interests. And until those interests and impacts have been properly unpacked, they're sort of afraid to commit to anything. So I think kind of thinking about that group and sort of learning or figuring out how to speak to their unique circumstances which are holding them back from committing to an ambitious treaty is going to be really important. So I think a strategy for the High Ambition Coalition should be dedicated bilateral outreach to countries like China, countries like India, Brazil, and sort of saying, what are your concerns? Let's put them out here and let's figure out, what an effective treaty looks like while still ensuring that you're not economically disadvantaged by these controls. And I don't actually think that that's an impossible ask. I think that there are countries that are willing to come around the table and have those conversations. There are some that probably aren't, and they're going to oppose everything no matter what. But I think figuring that strategy out is really part of the sort of game plan that needs to happen. Jacob, I know you've got thoughts on this, so please do bounce on in.
Yeah, no, I think your question is an interesting one, Paul, because we also need to think it's where the fossil fuel lobbyists derive their interest from as well, because there are some there that are private companies, and we need to manage and check their interests and conflict of interest, certainly, and constantly question whether or not profit making in plastics is aligned with protecting the environment and human health from the negative impacts, and understanding those conflict of interest that we thought about before, but also the long reach of the state's interest in their own domestic and fossil fuel industries, and their nationally and their state-owned entities that act in these negotiations. So these things are fluid, and I certainly agree with Chris that there is a difference between those that want to explore and further understand these controls that maybe wouldn't have been their first choice, of ways to address plastic pollution but want to understand more, and those that just simply refuse to discuss them outright and on any basis. So we shouldn't, not every country is a monolith. We shouldn't all assume that it's all fossil fuel interests driving these positions. For some, it certainly would be. And yeah, we need to continually review and assess like how the lobbyists are able to engage in the negotiations, in a negotiation that is about protecting human health and the environment ultimately, and the planet at large. So yeah, I could talk about this for a very long time.
We can do a special extended edition for you sometime, maybe the wrap-up one for the whole process.
Yeah.
We just talk till the last person tunes out. A final question for you both, and it's a bit of a random one, I guess, but based on where we are now, do you think it's possible to achieve such an ambitious treaty using consensus-based decision-making in the more traditional way that the world goes about addressing its problems? And if not, what are the alternatives even?
Yeah, I can go first on that. I think consensus-based decision-making, I think we've discussed it previously, but consensus-based decision-making sounds great, that everyone finds the agreement, everyone is happy in our, everyone's maybe not quite got what they want, but everyone is maybe happy with what the final outcome is. However, for solely consensus-based decision-making with no driver to create that consensus doesn't ultimately work, because you could have one country or party committee member say, I do not agree to this, despite you can't have a situation where one country who does not agree to something, you can allow that to prevent the kind of vast majority, hundreds of other countries discussing an issue that they want to discuss. That is not a beneficial way to do things. And therefore, relying solely on consensus actually isn't something that we've done in negotiations in the past. Most INCs to develop treaties have the precedent of having voting. Not many of them really ever use voting, but it's a way in which we drive people towards finding consensus, because there is the sword of Damocles, as it were, of the vote hanging over us. So we're in a situation in the INC where we have not quite resolved this form of decision making, and ultimately we will need to resolve that at some point. And certainly we would advocate that consensus-based decision making in the treaty, in the ultimate instrument, will also not be fit for purpose. So yes, we definitely do have to find a way to resolve that, and it's difficult, but needs to be done. In terms of alternatives, I think the alternative is for countries who agreed to the rules of procedure in Dakar, when they were first agreed, to ensure that there is no alternative really, because we are negotiating a treaty that needs on an issue that needs a global solution. And this treaty is going to be a critical part of ending plastic pollution for generation. So we really need to figure out a way to move through this. And we should, rather than focusing on what's our alternative, is more focused on ways around the obstructions that have been laid in our way, and a resolve to a real kind of committing to an ambitious vision and strengthening our resolve against the sort of bad faith negotiation tactics, rather than letting it completely derail us. So that would be my alternative. It's not really an alternative. It's more about kind of be a little bit stronger on these
nuancing
issues.
It.
Exactly.
Chris,
I was just going to maybe add something as well. I think, Jacob sort of said, if we'd resolved this at the beginning, we wouldn't be where we are now. And I think that's the issue, right? Is that at INC 1, the rules of procedure for the INC process were provisionally applied, which basically means they're not fully adopted. And at each meeting, we sort of approach it saying, is this going to be brought up again? And it kind of hasn't, right? So the can keeps getting kicked down the road. So that's how we are here, just for those who are not super in the weeds here. That's how we're here at INC4 without rules of procedure being formally adopted. It's pretty crazy, actually. And so the risk now is that, like at 11 p.m. on the last night of INC5, somebody's going to say, well, actually, we can't agree on this, let's have a vote. And it could blow up the whole thing. So I think it's really important to sort of recognize, why it's not that if we have voting that everyone's going to be voting willy-nilly on every single issue. Nobody wants that. It's the threat of the vote that drives consensus. And just having come from the UN Environment Assembly last month, this really was kind of like kicked home to me, that, the resolutions that were being adopted just really, it went almost unilaterally haywire, right? And I left the UN Environment Assembly thinking, crikey, I think like multilateralism might actually be dead. So there was just a small group of countries in almost every single resolution that was being negotiated that were kind of working together to essentially come out with nothing. So, whilst the UN Environment Assembly wasn't a complete failure, some resolutions were adopted, many weren't, and many of the final language was very, very weak. And that's an entirely sort of consensus-based process. So I think, just really learning from what we can see in the climate space, what we can see in other negotiations, there is a general sort of trend geopolitically that a number of countries are now opposing kind of multilateralism at large. And are we going to allow that? That's not a question I can answer, obviously, crikey. The question is like, but are we going to allow a small group of countries in every case to say like, no, we don't want to protect the environment, and no, we don't want to protect the planet, and we have the final say on that? I personally would say no, but we would then need quite a push from ambitious countries from across the board. I'm not talking about the global north. I'm talking countries around the world to come together and say, well, what do we accept as the minimum, and then striving towards that. So that's just what I would add on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. And a final thought from both of you before we wrap this one up. Obviously, you guys have put a ridiculous amount of hours and work dedicated to this entire process, and you've been steeped in it for years now. How optimistic are you that you're going to get what you're looking for out of INC4? Say on a scale of 1 to 10. Keep it easy.
On a scale of 1 to 10. Ooh. Yeah, Paul. Oh gosh, I feel like I'm ever the optimist. And yeah, you're right. I did. I accepted a job at EIA in 2019 to get a plastics treaty. And although I'm not solely responsible for achieving that goal, it's really important to me on a personal level because it's a really exciting area to work in. So I'm going to say a 7. I think that INC4 is going to be really, really critical. But I think that there's an energy to kind of get this done, and providing the countries that want to get this done are also not the first to compromise on some of the key elements, I think we'll get somewhere good by the end of INC4, and hopefully with a clear mandate for what's going to happen before INC5. So I'm going to go with a 7, but there's some caveats. There's just some caveats with the 7.
Jacob, the score of the door for you?
Yeah, good question. I think I can be in my work and personal life a bit of a pessimist, but I think I've been institutionalized by EIA and the work that I feel really confident in the people that we work with, that some of the countries that we speak to that are fighting the fight for their future and their ambition, and also the people across civil society and rights holders that we get to work with that work so hard to push for an equitable treaty that can solve the problems that they are facing, that some of them are life and death issues, and with that level of resolve, I think we can really continue to push the needle. So I'm gonna give it a 7.
Yes.
But a 7 is pretty high for me.
That is high. That's pure like treaty Kool-Aid energy that you're giving, Jacob. But I love it. That's what we need for INC4.
Nice one, Jacob. I understand as well. It's impossible to withstand the relentless assault of Christina's optimism.
You need the duality in the team, though, Paul. You need those polarizations.
The yin to your yang. Well, thank you both very much indeed for joining us today, and I hope you can find the time in a few weeks' time to come back and tell us how it went, and then we can we'll reconvene ahead of INC5. But thank you very much both. It's been a pleasure.
Far away for now, but yeah, I'm sure it will come round very quickly.
Thanks, Paul. It's been fun as always.
Excellent. Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes, and do check out our website at aia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks for joining us today, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.